And welcome to the first episode of I Love Immunology. Yay! We're going to spend a lot of time on this because this deals with a particular little problem that we have going right now called COVID. So I think it's important we understand this topic very well. As you might have seen, I'm going to have two lectures. I'll probably do that throughout the rest of the quarter. The first lecture, I just want to give you kind of a basic background on either the system we're talking about or the pathophysiology that we'll be dealing with. The second lecture, I'm going to revert to the ATI format in your ATI book. We're going to follow the exemplars that the ATI is pointing out because ATI is going to be doing your NCLEX review. So I want to be sure we hit on those topics that ATI has pointed out. Hopefully it'll make your review go better. And hopefully it's the same things that NCLEX is testing you on. So that's why we hired NCLEX or hired ATI. So we shall see. But there it is, the human immune system. Yay! Boink. Let's try that again. Boink. There we go. Okay, here's a little cartoon. I usually leave that sitting out there while I give the other talk, so you got something to laugh at, but I already did the other talk. So anyway, read quickly. There we go. This will make more sense when the lecture's over. Keep an eye out for this guy. He's my favorite bug. I love this character. Okay, immunity is a part of our human system, the immune system. It's actually a concept, the idea of immunity. And immunity as a concept is anything the body uses to protect itself against infection and disease. So this is something you might want to remember, the concept of immunity. Because when you do your nursing diagnoses, you're not going to put lupus, you're not going to put rheumatoid arthritis. You're going to put a compromised immune system because we really don't care what's causing the person's immune system to be compromised. We care about treating those symptoms and making sure the person doesn't go into shock or die. So remember that concept of immunity. Body's protective response to infection and disease. Might see it again. Now, as you can see, the immune system is very simple. All you have to do is just memorize this chart right here, and you will pass every question on the test. You do know I'm joking, right? I put this on here to demonstrate that the actual process by which your immune system works is extremely complicated when you get down to the CD4s and the CD3s and the macrophages and neutrophils. I'm going to try to make this as simple as I possibly can. There are a lot of terms that you will come up against, like CD4 native TN cell. Don't worry about that stuff. You really need to be an immunologist to understand all of this stuff right here. So for those of you who are going to go on to med school and become an immunologist, you can put this in your memory bank. Let's start simple. Your body has three basic levels of defense. The first, the non-specific, is the innate immune system. Now, this includes things like your skin, your mucous membranes, the big row of macrophages and neutrophils in your blood system that just gobble up anything and everything. So in other words, if it gets into your body and your body doesn't recognize it, it kills it. Now, the second level, or the adaptive immune system, is broken down into humoral immunity and cellular immunity. And these guys is when we start getting into the T cells and B cells. They're a lot more specific. They actually have to go out and look at the markers on the cell and say, is this a friendly cell or is this a foreign cell? A foreign cell would be like a bacteria or a virus. Or it may look at our own cell and see if it's sick. In the case of a cancer cell, it'll recognize that the cell is sick and it will kill that cell as well. This is how our body guards against us getting cancer. So the humoral level, they're mostly intercellular fluids, the bloodstream and the lymph system. And then when you get down to cellular immunity, they're actually going into the cells. But we'll talk about that later. Oh, there's that bug again. Yeah, just remember the innate or non-specific, but it's in the name right there, non-specific. Where'd my pen go? There it is. You know, it kills everything. Anything that gets in your body that is not part of your human tissue, it wipes out. The adaptive immune system, it needs a few more clues. You know, it's going to actually walk up to the cell or the being and say, show me your license, give me your ID. I want to see your passport. And then if they recognize it as being foreign, then they will act against it at that point. Okay, this is a chart that I made up for a previous class that I think works pretty well. And I'm going to use this as an analogy to help you kind of understand. The innate system, non-specific, they're both the same thing. It's kind of like the infantry. They just shoot at everything downrange. The adaptive immune system is more like our special forces. They sneak in and get the bad guys. So we'll start here with the innate immune system. Now that's broken into two parts. You got the external and the internal. The external is the skin, mucous membrane, and the internal, you start to look at all of the white blood cells. Now we're going to get to those white blood cells. And when you were looking at the CBC and it showed you all the different types of white blood cells, CBC with differential, and I'll talk about that in the next hour. These guys are basically our first line of defense once something gets past the skin. Well, I want to use an example here. Your skin is like the castle walls. It just keeps everything out. Whereas your mucous membranes, which are also a part of your external innate system, there are proteins and acids and stuff that kill whatever's trying to get into your body. For example, in your digestive tract. We all probably know, or if not, we will find out in Med-Surg 2, when you study the GI tract under Eileen, that your stomach has an acid pH of about 1. That is very acidic, which is why when you have indigestion and your gastric fluid goes up into your esophagus, it burns because you literally have acid in your stomach. That's one of the defense mechanisms. It kills anything that's alive in your stomach so that the bacteria, fungus, pathogen, protozoa, whatever, doesn't get down into your intestines and make you sick. So those are your two lines of defense, basically your skin, your mucous membrane, and every part of your body where you have an opening, your respiratory tract, digestive, urinary, reproductive system has these enzymes and proteins to help protect it against external forces. Now, where this comes into play is if we give somebody, just as an example, if we give somebody an antibiotic, it might kill off, you have friendly bacteria in your urinary tract, which keep you from getting things like yeast infections. Well, if we give you a bacteria or an antibiotic, antibiotics kill everything in your digestive tract. So it kills the friendly bacteria too, which is why people on antibiotics are susceptible to getting a yeast infection. And that's why we encourage the person on antibiotics to eat yogurt or take a probiotic pill so as to put the friendly bacteria back in the urinary tract. Hopefully the antibiotic will kill the bad bacteria and will replace the good bacteria and you'll be healthy. That's the external innate immune system. Any questions on that before I move to the internal innate immune system? That's all pretty simple, right? But then we get into the complicated stuff. This is the fun stuff, right? There are several white blood cells, and I think you've heard of them by now. If not, well, here they are. We have neutrophils, macrophages. I don't know why that's doing that, but anyway, it does. Killer cells, which I think natural killer cells is like the coolest name ever. Looks like it should be in a Jason Statham movie. And dendritic cells. Now, these three right here, I'm going to talk about. The dendritic, I'm just going to I'll just give you a brief familiarity with that. You'll also see on the CBC with differential, you will see something called monocytes. Now, monocytes by themselves don't do anything. They morph into macrophages and dendritic cells. So these guys, the monocytes, are basically just a precursor to the macrophages, distant relative, if you will. So the monocytes don't actually kill anything. Once they become a macrophage, then they go for it. Now, there's a couple things you'll need to remember about these. Together, the neutrophils and macrophages, we call them phagocytes. The definition of a phagocyte is a cell that eats another cell. They're like Pac-Mans. They're little Pac-Mans. That's the best way to think about neutrophils and macrophages. They're Pac-Mans. Neutrophils are the most abundant in the bloodstream, and I'll cover that more in the next lecture when we talk about the CBC with differential. These guys will eat the bad guy and die. They're a one and done cell. They will eat the bacteria or the antigen, and then they die. And when they die, they become white and they collect at the site of the infection. And this is what we call pus. So when you have a site that is infected, the neutrophils rush there. They're the first line of defense. They eat everything that they don't recognize, and then they die, and then they secrete in your wound as pus. So that's what pus is. The next one are the macrophages. Now, the macrophage, they don't eat and die. They just keep eating. So these guys recycle. They come from the monocytes, like I told you before, and they just basically consume the pathogens and then they spit them out. For those of you who watched the, maybe it's not in the first crash course, number 45, but it will be in 46, is these guys are like the villains in Thunderdome, where they race around in a post-apocalyptic world and they wear the parts of their enemy on their skin. They actually take parts of those pathogens that they ate and they put part of their body system, they wear it on the outside of their cell. And then our little friend here, the dendritic cell, runs over and takes a look at it and then passes that information on to the specific immune system. I'll show you how that works in a minute. So these guys are kind of really what you might consider the hard rock part of your immune system. They also come in two different flavors. There are those that just float around in the bloodstream, and there's those that actually attach to the tissue body, and they have little dendrites that reach out and they grab the pathogen and they pull it in and they consume them and they eat them. And this is really a rather morbid lecture, isn't it? But anyway, that's what the macrophages do. They don't look at the ID of the item. They just look at it, see it's not a human cell, and they eat it. So these guys, the natural killer cells, they are a little bit different. These guys are a little more sophisticated. Like I said, like the secret police. They're bad. Anyway, well, they're good for us, but they're bad for the enemy. They seek out the body's own cells. In other words, they walk around and they look at the cells in our body. Now, every body's cell has a little marker on it called an MC1 marker. It's like a driver's license or a passport. Every cell in our body has one that says, yes, I'm a part of this body. If the natural killer cell comes across a pathogen or a cell that doesn't have that marker, it doesn't eat it. What it does is it injects it with an enzyme so that the cell dies. Poisons them, I guess, is a better way to put it. But it doesn't only do that with non-human pathogens, but it'll do that with the human cell. Because when a human cell gets sick, like it develops cancer, the way it marks itself for self-destruction, so to speak, is its MHC1 doesn't look right. It's defective. So when this natural killer cell comes across this cell with a bad MHC1, it's kind of like a fake ID, the natural killer cell will kill that cell also. And that's how it prevents cancer. You know, when your cell gets cancerous, it doesn't produce the MHC1s properly. It's kind of like sending out a signal saying, help, I'm not healthy. So the natural killer cell will come by, inject it with an enzyme, and the cell will kill itself. This is really a morbid lecture. Anyway, the dendritic cells are different in the sense that they kind of go between the innate or non-specific system and the adaptive or specific system. This guy, this dendritic cell, and I think I have a slide right here. You want to remember basically what each of these do. Bump. This is the information I'm looking at. Okay. Moving on. Here's a quick presentation of the dendritic cell. The dendritic cell eats a bacteria, and it takes the body parts and puts it on the outside of its cell. And then T cells, which are part of your adaptive immune system, come by and see that antigen, and that's what activates your adaptive immune system and gets it producing antibodies to help kill whatever that particular pathogen is. But the dendritic cell can also pick up these parts from the macrophage. So it can pick that part up. If we go back here, the dendritic cell here will go over to the macrophage and pick up one of those parts and take that to the T cell, and then the T cell will then produce all the antibiotics or the antibodies and stuff necessary to get the adaptive immune system going. So the dendritic cell is kind of like a liaison between your non-specific and your specific immune system. You don't need to really know any details about the dendritic cell because I won't go into a lot of detail on that one. Some things you do want to remember. Phagocytes eat the bad guys. Those are your neutrophils and your macrophages. And the dendrites are its main function. I mean, it will kill pathogens and such, but its main job is the messenger between your innate and your adaptive immune system. So that is your non-specific immune system or your innate immune system. Does anybody have any questions about that before I move on? Because now I'm going to dive into the adaptive immune system. It's going to get a little more complicated. It's all pretty simple. I'm going to go back over all of those characters again on the next lecture when I talk about the CB complete blood count with differential, because you'll actually be getting labs that show how much you have of each of those characters I just talked about. Moving on to the adaptive immune system, you'll remember that I said there is a humoral and there is a cellular immune system. The humoral system uses the B cells, and I'm sure we've all probably heard of B cells and T cells before. The T cells, especially when we're talking about HIV and AIDS, that disease kills your T cells, and you'll see why that can be fatal as we progress through this series of lectures. Each of those, the B cells and the T cells, can break down into 4 or 5 different types of cells, each of which has a different function in your immune system, and it can get quite complicated. So what I'm going to do is we're just going to try to keep it as simple as we can and just cover the 2 primary cells that they divide into, and so you can get a clear picture of what happens. Now, moving on, there again, the adaptive immune system breaks down into the humoral and the cellular. And that, I probably should have put those titles up here, but I didn't. I'll go back and do that. But both of these use a secret weapon called antibodies. You've all heard of them. They've been in the news. They're everywhere. They're as popular as Beyonce because of COVID. So we're going to talk about antigens, antibodies, immunities, and all that wonderful stuff that's in the news every day and that most people out there have no clue what they're talking about. But you will. Antigen. What is an antigen? An antigen is a bad guy. That's basically it. Antigens are bad guys. These are parts that are on the cell of whatever pathogen gets into your body. So much like our cells have a MHC1 connected to them saying, hey, I'm a part of this body, whatever pathogen, whether it be bacteria, virus, you name it, it gets into your body, it's going to have different markers on it. Now, once a macrophage has eaten this pathogen or a dendrite has eaten this pathogen, it takes these little bad guys characters and it puts it on their skin. And then along comes a B cell, which then says, oh, this is bad. And the B cell will then produce antibodies. Now, the antibodies are the good guys. But as you can see, every antibody matches one particular antigen. So say this is the antigen that belongs to the COVID virus. This antigen belongs to the flu virus. If this antibody runs into the flu virus, it will do nothing. This antibody is specific to the COVID virus. When it runs into that, it'll do its thing. But all these other antibodies won't do anything. So the antibody has to match the pathogen. And that's why the adaptive immune system is called the specific immune system, because it's targeting particular pathogens. How does it do that? Well, I'll explain that here in a second. You'll hear the term thrown around a lot, immunoglobulins. Immunoglobulins are another name for antibodies. In other words, when we take antibodies and we break them down into different types of antibodies, we call those immunoglobulins. For example, the IgG right here mostly talks about an antibiotic that crosses over the placenta into the child. And each one of these pathogens, and it's in your reading material, is a part of a different part of your body and attacks different types of pathogens. The one we are mostly concerned about with right now is IgE, because that's going to be involved in a lot of your allergic reactions, which we will study as we go on. We will mention these as we go along. It's not important that you memorize these for any reason. Just remember that these are immunoglobulins, and an immunoglobulin is another name for an antibody. So that being said, so what do antibodies do? Well, once the B cell has discovered that there's a bad guy in town, and he will start producing antibodies, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It starts spitting out antibodies. Now, these antibodies can do a couple of things. One thing it can do is it can alert other B cells so that they can produce even more antibodies. But what it does is it marks the cell. As soon as the antibody runs into the antibody runs into the antigen that it matches up with, it connects to it. Now this will do three things, basically what it does. One thing it can do is it can totally surround the cell with antibodies. So now this pathogen can't connect to any of your healthy body tissues because the antigens or the antibodies have blocked all of its receptors. So it kind of like forms a shield around it so that that antigen can't connect to your body tissues. And then it hangs out. The second thing it does is it marks it for destruction, so that when your neutrophils or your macrocytes come along and they see this, the antibodies are saying, eat me, and the Pac-Mans eat them up and kill them. The third thing it can do is it agglutinates. The antibodies will connect to each other. So as these antibodies are connecting to the antigens, they will connect to each other as well, and it will form a big cluster of these antigens, which just make a bigger target for your white blood cells to come by and consume. So that's just a couple of the things that antibodies do, but basically they're markers to mark who the enemy is, which is why you get a vaccine to produce those antibodies in your system. So the minute that a pathogen gets into your body, your immune system can go to work right away. Now, that being said, let's say you're a young child and you haven't had the measles yet. You don't have any antibodies. So a B cell has to find this measles and has to start producing a factory to produce antibodies, which go to other B cells to produce more antibodies. And then eventually you build up an immunity to that system. Now, you may be sick during that time. But then what happens is now you have all these antibodies floating through your body. So the next time a measles gets into your body, the antibodies just grab onto it right away and kill it, which is why you have an immunity to measles, because these antibodies are floating around in your body. Now, different types of antibodies last a different length of time. So, and plus we have the problem that antigens mutate. So in the case of the flu, you have the flu, and then you produce the antibodies for that particular strain of flu, and you kill that strain of flu. Well, the next year, this antigen comes back, but he is mutated. So now these antibodies don't work anymore. So you're starting all over again. So that's one of the problems with natural immunity and some of our immunizations, like the flu shot. That's why you have to get the flu shot every year, because they change it to match the modified flu or whatever strain of flu is floating around. So just remember what agglutination is. I'm looking at my clock. Okay, well, I'm going to boogie through here a little faster. I'm going a little over time. So how does this work? Well, the B cells are a part of your humoral immune system. They're the outer perimeter. When they encounter a pathogen, they will break into two different types of cells. Now, the B cells does two things. It doesn't kill the pathogen directly, but what it does do is it starts producing all those wonderful antigens that we want. And the B cells mostly hang out in your bloodstream and your lymph system, and they're intercellular. They float between the cells. They also call the cavalry. And that's where it sends a signal out that, whoop, I need help. And the cavalry is the T cells. And also the phagocytes. There's also another batch of cells that get produced when it encounters a antibody, and that's the memory B cells. And this is the guy that remembers what that antibody looks like. So the next time the body encounters that pathogen, it can immediately produce antibodies, which is wonderful, right? This T cell is the cellular immune system. I'm sorry, I didn't put that title in there, but I need to. And there again, we're only going to talk about two of those cells. One of them is the helper T cell, which there again helps memorize the antibodies. And then the cytotoxic T cell. This is like the killer cell. This is the one that goes around and kills those cells that are bad. This is the real workhorse of your innate immune system, the T cell, because like the natural killer cells, it is the one that's actually killing off those bad cells. If you look over here, you'll see the B cell is producing antibodies and memorizing the antibodies. And the helper T cells help to collect the data that goes to the cytotoxic T cells. But the cytotoxic T cells, those are the ones doing the work. And not only will it kill pathogens that are foreign, but this guy is also the one that looks around to try to see if any of your natural body's systems are defective. Now, if you know a virus, you'll know a virus gets inside of a cell and starts playing around with the DNA. The cytotoxic T cell can recognize that from the MHC and kill that cell that's infected with the virus. Also, a cancer cell. Cancer cell will also be producing defective MHC markers. So it will attack that as well. So these T cells are what keeps away cancer and viruses. And we'll talk about what happens when your T cells get too low when we get to HIV and AIDS. The important thing to remember is that B cells are the ones that produce the antibodies that your whole body uses to fight the disease, whereas the T cells themselves will actually go after the guys, and the cytotoxic T cells will kill them. Now, I don't know what B stands for in B cells, but to help you remember this a little bit, these are produced in the bone marrow. So B can stand for bone marrow. T cells are produced in the bone marrow, but they migrate to the thymus, which sits on top of your heart. The thymus gland then matures the T cells so that they can go out and do their job. Now, there's debate in the scientific community if T cell was actually named after the thymus, but for our memory purposes, it's a good idea to remember it that way. T cells, thymus. Where do T cells come from? The thymus. Got that, right? There's that bug again. So there we go. We have the whole charts complete now. We have the helper cells, the cytotoxic cells, the two cells there. That's basically the simplest way to break it all down. Do we have any questions at all on either the innate or the adaptive immune system? Now, that being said, I will go into more detail on these different cells when we have the next lecture at 11 o'clock. It'll be, but I want you to have this background before we talk about it, because we're going to talk about their specific function and what their levels are in your complete blood count and differential. Got it? Here's a quick overview of immunity. Next week, we'll talk more in depth about immunity. But basically, there are three different types of immunity. There's actually four. The fourth one's kind of odd, but I'll talk about that next week. The important ones are, the naturally acquired active immunity. Now, the naturally acquired immunity are things like measles, mumps, and stuff for which you do not get a vaccine. Flu would be another example where the pathogen gets in your body and your body produces the antibodies to fight off that disease. Now, that is opposed to artificially acquired, where we give you a vaccine. Now, the vaccine, we're putting that pathogen in your body, we're putting the antigen in your body, but we have modified or killed the antigen so that it can't harm you. In other words, another way of thinking about it is when we give you a measles vaccine, we're basically giving you dead measles. So they won't make you sick, but the dead body parts, like the macrophage wears on its skin, that's basically what the vaccine is we're putting those markers into your system so that your body can launch an immune system against it. The B cells will see these antigens and they will produce antibodies and get the whole cycle started to fight off whatever it is you're trying to prevent. COVID vaccine is a little different in that it uses modified RNA, but we'll talk about that when we get there. Now, one more that you need to know about is passive acquired immunity. And this is like the immunity where the mother passes the antibodies on to the child. There again, she's passing on antibodies directly, and they don't last long. So the child will be protected for a very short period of time, but then the child's own acquired immune system has to fire up and start doing its thing in order to protect the child. So this is just to kind of protect the child right after birth until the child's own immune system can get fired up and going. One thing to remember is older people, their immune system gets weak. It's harder for them to produce the monocytes. It's harder for them to produce the B cells and T cells. So vaccines can be a little less effective in older people. Something to kind of put in your memory bank there. Any questions on immunity before we leave here? The crash course videos, I'm going to put one in each week. They're number 45, 46, 47. If you want to go ahead and watch all three of them, all three of those talk about the immune system. They're really good videos. The guy does an excellent job of explaining it. And that can, you can get ahead on that if you want to. Any questions before we leave? Clear as mud, right? I will stop sharing. Does anybody have any questions on the material that I have just covered?
Nope.
Nope. In that case, I will stop the recording. As soon as I find the right button. There we go.